Okay, well, today I don't really have a slide presentation to go. There's not visuals so much because we're really going to be talking about the fashion supply chain. And if you have any questions, just ask it, okay? So you can stop me anytime and ask any question. So when we're going to be talking about the fashion supply chain, we're going to be talking about our fashion industry, as in the industry that's based in the European American point of view and owned by Europeans and Americans. So from here on out, whenever I refer to the fashion industry, I am particularly talking about the industry that we know from America and Europe. So as you know, like what we learned with Louis is that when Louis kind of decided that fashion was going to be the export for France, that kind of started what we know as our fashion industry, and that really made fashion local. So the supply chain to make fashion was very local. Like Louis made the fashion in France, and then he exported that fashion to other countries. So if we go further down the line and we look at Chanel, Chanel's clothing was made in France. Gucci's leather goods were made in Italy. So where the brand was located and where the products were made went hand in hand. They were from that country. They were a proud product of that country. And that product was identified by its location. You could tell it was it's Italian leather, or it's a French dress. It's very much tied to not only its designers, but the country they came from. For example, like American jeans, like Levi's is wholeheartedly American. It's that kind of an idea. And so when ready-to-wear first came on the scene, which was at the turn of the century after the Industrial Revolution, that kind of changed everything, because before that, if you were rich, you were either importing your fashion from France, you were either buying from the very prestigious tailors in your capital city, like Savile Row in London or Fifth Avenue in New York. You might not have been bringing in French fashion, but you very well were buying in the very prestigious tailors in your capital city. But and if you didn't have the money, you were wearing hand-me-downs, you were making your own. There were little general stores that would sell things here or there. But for example, let's say you were a maid in an aristocrat's home, you would actually get the hand-me-downs from the family. So people weren't buying new clothes, really. They were mending, they were making their own. Little general stores would sell things. But ready-to-wear changed everything. And ready-to-wear was that you could walk into a store and there would be a dress there complete, ready to buy. Prior to that, you would pick out your fabrics and your trims, and your tailor would make your dress. And even if you were, a middle-class person, you would walk into the general store, buy the fabric, and make your own dress at home. There weren't racks of clothing to take home complete by. So ready-to-wear changes that. And the high-end designers that we know today, like Chanel or Gucci or any of those, they all, like Chanel's the best example because she's the oldest for clothing. They launched a ready-to-wear. And that was her way of always having that aspiring customer we've talked about. But the challenge with ready-to-wear is that it's price point driven. For the rich, the aristocrats aren't going to buy a dress hanging there where there's a size run for many people to own it. They want a very unique, customized dress. So they're going to keep going to Chanel to have her make them a dress, or fit a dress. But a bourgeois person, let's say an attorney's wife, she's okay buying a dress that's hanging there. So price point's going to be very, very important to ready-wear. And the only way to get a good price point is to get the cost of labor down. And so the supply chain in fashion is all based upon price point, or it has been in the past. And so if you are buying the highest echelon fashion, like haute couture, high fashion, it's made in country at the labor cost of that country. But as we go into ready to wear, where the garments are made are getting further and further away from the designer. So for example, at the turn of the century, the cheap place to have clothing made was America. America at the turn of the century was present day China. It was the home of mass-produced cheap goods. We were very industrialized. We had big factories with big machinery. We very much invested, especially the North, in industrialization and in factories and in production. So America really is really the heart and soul of getting ready to wear off the ground, because we were growing cotton in the South, and then the North was turning that raw cotton into fabric and then sewing the fabric into garments. We would sell those garments in New York stores or Philadelphia stores or Chicago stores. And then we were also exporting those goods back to Europe at a much cheaper price for their middle class. So if you were rich at the time, you would never want to wear an American good, because that was mass-produced garments, or like cheap, kind of how people sort of view Chinese goods now. That's exactly how they would have viewed American goods back then. And so when we talk about the supply chain, we need to understand that to manufacture and get a lower price, the labor has to get cheaper. So as countries industrialize, that's when that opens the door to a cheaper manufacturing. So if a country is unindustrialized, you can exploit that labor a bit better. If a country is industrializing, they're investing in machinery, they can also offer a cheaper price because they're not investing in people, they're investing in machinery. And that's what America was doing. America was kind of twofold at the Industrial Revolution. One, we were employing children. And two, we were heavily invested in machinery. And so the better the machinery, the less people you need to make it. And so as we go through the 20th century, America really was the heart and soul of ready to wear and more of like the middle class fashion. And Europe stayed kind of the heart of that high-end aristocratic fashion. But in the early 1970s, China opens. Nixon opens China. And this really, really changes how we see fashion, and it really changes our supply chain. Because when Nixon opened China, that opened up a new cheap labor force, and a big one for fashion designers. And so that's really kind of a second boom to fashion. And that's really how we get the fashion industry that we know today. Because when China opened, one, we had a very cheap labor force at our available. Two, it was wide open because China was just beginning to industrialize. And three, China wanted to be seen on the world stage. So they were very ecstatic to be working with American and European companies to build this industrial complex. And so for design houses, design companies at the time, this was sort of like that perfect timing for success. And an example I'm going to use to explain it is Ralph Lauren. So in the 60s, Ralph Lauren made ties. His background is he was a salesman at Bloomingdale's, I believe. And he sold men's ties, and he really couldn't find the kind of ties that he liked to wear. The thin ties were in, and he wanted the big, thick ties with bold, fun prints. And so he went to a tailor, and he had the tailor start making him his own ties. and he would wear them working at Bloomingdale's, and he eventually talked Bloomingdale's into carrying his ties. And that's kind of how Ralph Lauren got started, with men's neckties. Well, when China opened, by the time Nixon opens China, Ralph Lauren has expanded beyond neckties, and he's making menswear, and he's making it in New York City, just how fashion designers worked at the time. Prior to China opening, whether you were making high-end design or ready to wear in America, you were making your goods in America. America was still producing apparel. We were still producing fabric. We were still growing cotton, and we were still sewing the garments. You could, as an American designer, you could buy your raw cotton from the South, have it turned into fabric in the North, and you could have it sewn in the North or the West. But your entire supply chain could exist in America still in the 1960s. And that's how it was for Ralph Lauren. But when Nixon opened China, that like we said, opened the door. So what Ralph Lauren did was they eventually moved their manufacturing from New York to China. And companies like that, like DKNY is another very popular one, they actually built the factories. They invested in the newest and latest machinery. They invested in the newest and latest technology and fabrics. For example, in the 70s, polyester was a brand new fabric, which was, going to revolutionize housewives, because it didn't need to be ironed. It didn't have all of these fussiness that the all natural products had. And so this kind of combination of China opening, new man-made technologies in fabric, new machinery to make clothes quicker and faster, was all kind of coming together. And the designers that were working at the time that had the capital could really invest in that. And they did. And so these American companies went to China, built the factories in China, invested in the machinery, and basically these American lines started being manufactured in China, which then is what began the global supply chain. That is when we first see that products that are made by an American company are actually not produced in America. And what that did, because now you could make your goods for so much cheaper than you were making them in, say, New York or LA, that you could expand your offering and sort of dabble in all kinds of things. And that's what you see with like Ralph Lauren. And eventually, he can grow an empire, and you can have licensing, because he can offer so many products that he could never manage having made here in America. And so when we look at those huge empire type brands like Ralph Lauren or Donna Karan, it's not about, although Ralph Lauren is incredibly talented, his success level is not so much based on his talent as it is based on the timing and the product that he brought to market. But the timing is absolutely essential to being able to for him to have built that type of empire. For example, now if you open a line, it's almost a given that your supply chain is going to be in Asia somewhere, but that can really tie up your capital. So that can actually sink you. Whereas in the 70s and 80s, that was actually going to guarantee your success. Does that make sense? Kind of, or do
yes.
So you're kind of following how that works?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we talk about the supply chain, like I said, prior to Nixon opening China, you could, and we're going to talk about it in America, okay? You could buy your raw cotton right off the bush from the South, because the South was still growing cotton. That cotton would be sent to the North, where the factories in the North were weaving the cotton into fabrics. America was mostly making cottons. and then they would be sewn into clothing either in the Northeast or the West. Like LA was a huge sewing. But once Nixon opened China, now the supply chain is very, very different. Now the corporate headquarters or the designer is located in America. For example, let's take Donna Karan, or even Ralph Lauren. But we'll say Donna Karan because she calls herself Donna Karan of New York. And if we remember back, like Chanel or Gucci, they are all very tied to where they're from. Chanel is French with French fashion. So Donna Karan is a New Yorker. She really is from New York. And her corporate offices and her design offices were in New York. But after she moved, her manufacturing, her supply chain was in China, which means we have to think about what was she buying, if anything. By the time she's having her garments sewn in China, she is not buying fabric from America. She's not buying the raw goods. She's not buying the finished fabrics, and she's not even having her goods sewn in America. So now her supply chain is coming from somewhere in Asia, and probably her fabric is being grown maybe in Turkey, let's say. It's being turned into fabric probably in Bangladesh, and then it's being sewn in China. So if we follow her footprint, right? We start in New York City with our corporate and our designers. We take the pattern. We then go over to Turkey where they're growing the cotton or whatever the fabric's going to be made out of. Let's say she's using natural fibers and not man-made fibers. And then that raw cotton is being then sent to Bangladesh where it's being woven and turned into fabric for her designs. And then that fabric then is being sent to China to be sewn into the garments. Then it's put on a boat and it's shipped back to New York, where then it sits in her warehouse, and then they cipher it off to all the different stores in America that it's going to go to. Can you guys see this, how big the footprint of the fashion supply chain has gotten since China opened up compared to before, like in the 60s, where you were only buying raw goods from the South, it was being sewn in the North, and your corporate offices were probably in New York, Chicago, or LA. It was very contained to America. Now it's like these garments are traveling kind of the world. Do you see that?
Yeah, I have a question. Is that like a good thing? Like, yeah, it's being cheaper. It's like they're getting a good price for their stores.
Right.
But isn't the quality of their clothes, is it like cheaper?
Well, the quality probably, it depends on the brand. Let's say it's Donna Karan. The quality is going to be what Donna Karan sets out her quality to be. Every designer or design house or brand has a quality that they believe is best for their brand or justifies the price tag of their brand. I think, though, there's a quality difference between when it's sewn in New York City and people from corporate can walk over to a factory that's a couple streets over and see their garments sewn and make sure they're using the right zippers and the right weight of jersey, versus it being sewn all the way in China, where either you have to have someone from America live in China and oversee that factory, or just hope for the best. And when it arrives in New York, you're hoping they use the zippers you actually bought. So quality, you can't control quality well. And I think that there's things to think about with it is, one, you would be doing that global landscape because you're trying to get your prices down. You're trying to buy cheaper raw cotton. You're trying to have the cotton woven at a cheaper price. And then you're trying to get it sewn cheaper. So each part of that chain, you're trying to bring your price down so that the finished garment is a much lower price, maybe not to pass that savings on to your customer, but to increase your profit margin. So yeah, quality oftentimes could be compromised because with each step that it's traveling that path, You're trying to bring, these design houses are trying to bring the price down, and then they're trying to increase their profits. Because remember, fashion isn't art, it's a business. So at every turn, they're looking at the bottom, they're looking on as a line item, how can I bring the cost down to increase my profits? And then the other thing you have to ask yourself, which is a hot topic when we look at that trace globally, how much that garment traveled, is the impact on the environment. That's a lot of shipping from here to here to here to here all over the globe. That's kind of unnecessary. And we think that at one point, not that long ago, all of these garments were being made within country, and that shipping was, you know, on a railroad or whatever, very, very tidy and kind of tight, you know, but the cost is higher. For example, we make all of our garments in San Diego, and we have to pay San Diego minimum wage, which is, I think, is $13 an hour. So we have to, when we price our garments, we have to figure out how many can they sew in an hour. And if we say 4, then at the base, our sewing costs per that garment is like $6 or something, and that's without fabric or trims or pattern or designer. So you can see that. And so when I teach you guys how price structure works, you'll see that, for example, let's say that t-shirt, let's say I'm going to have a t-shirt made in my factory, and they can do 5 t-shirts in an hour. So my sewing, let's say, is $4. Well, that's only my sewing. That's just what I'm going to pay my factory. So that doesn't include the fabric. It does not include the labels. It does not include the pattern, and it does not include the designer that sketched and designed and probably made and graded that shirt. It's just that $4 is just the sewing. So let's say I'm not going to include any of those other costs. My wholesale on that shirt is going to be $8. And my retail is going to be 16, but there's all those other costs. So let's say those other costs are equal sewing. So I'm at $8 in costs. Now that same t-shirt is now $32 retail. Okay. So when you think about, so that's why designers end up, because when you go to China, that same sewing might be $1. And so it can be very, you can get seduced into looking at going on a global scale because the price per item is so cheap, but you might have to buy 300 t-shirts, whereas at my factory, she'll make 20 for me. And so I then don't overproduce. I didn't ship it halfway across the country and back. And I know my quality is there because I buy my fabric from my vendor. She sews it in-house. It's delivered to my design house. And so there's much more quality control. So that price of $32, my customer really is getting a t-shirt that is truly worth $32. Whereas you may or may not be getting that from another brand that, because the global supply chain is so big, and these garments are traveling to so many different places and going to so many different factories that quality can kind of get lost on that path, besides the disaster for the environment, obviously. All right, and questions? So when you guys think about your lower end, okay, so your highest end, like when we think about our highest end today, really nobody wears haute couture. And what Louis called haute couture is really what we think of high end now, because real haute couture of today, nobody wears it. It's just runway show stuff. So when I talk about high design, I'm going to be talking about like Chanel, Christian Dior, that kind of stuff. And that's really what Louis was talking about. Technically, it should all still be made in France, to justify the price point that they charge, because they're charging on the idea that it is made in France. However, with the global supply chain, somehow they have gotten away with not being made in France. For example, Louis Vuitton handbags should be made in France to justify their price tag, but they're made in China. They are no longer a French-made good. They're French designed, but they are not made in France. They are made in China. And I think that because the supply chain has gotten to be so global, consumers don't realize that these price points, they're still getting away with charging these price points as if they are made in that country. But a lot of them aren't. The only high-end design brand that's French that is still actually made in France is Hermes. That's the only one. The rest of them, like Chanel, they're all made in China, which means their price really should be going down, because their cost to make, their supply chain costs along the way have all gone down as well. But they don't have to bring their price down, because now they're selling on exclusivity only. It's not, people aren't buying Chanel simply because it's super nice quality and it's made in France. They're buying it because it's Chanel at this point. So in the 80s, when China opened and the brands could really make their supply chain globally and bring down each line item in price, they could also create a brand that then people would covet wearing that brand, instead of worrying about how that brand was made. The shift went more about wearing the brand, whereas before it was, the status was that it was made in that country. For example, the status of wearing Chanel was that it was made in France, but that doesn't exist anymore with the supply chain being global. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Do you guys have any questions? So okay. So let's say you open your line and you want to have it all made in America. Okay. So the problem you're going to face is that a lot of the different parts of the supply chain to fashion have left America completely. Like, there's no way for you to have your garment made start to finish. So for example, to make the supply chain in fashion starts with a creative director or a designer, and then you're going to have a pattern maker. The designer might be a pattern maker, or you might hire a pattern maker. You have to have manufacturing because you're selling something you're making. So you're going to have a cutter, you're going to have a sewer or a factory, and you're probably going to have someone who packages them for you, puts them in bags so that they ship to stores nice and they don't get dirty in shipping or whatever. The creative director, you may or may not have a creative director. You have to have a designer. So the designer could be the creative director, or you could have two different jobs. Those two people work in an office. They might have offices in a warehouse, but they're kind of an office staff. The designer, if she is a designer that also makes patterns, then you probably don't need a pattern maker, because your designer is the pattern maker, and she is probably working in their offices. They probably have some kind of big design space with big tables for cutting, pattern making, maybe fabric design, that kind of a thing. But that kind of part to the supply chain is in an office like New York City or LA or Chicago or Atlanta, but they're there. And then you have the manufacturing side of the supply chain, and brands can make that design office side always look pretty, always look like everything is perfect and they treat their people well. It's the manufacturing side that gets a little hazy, because that's when the jobs are no longer in America anymore. And so that's when we can kind of not know what's going on in that part of the supply chain. So the top of the supply chain is your offices, like your creative director, your designers, your pattern makers. And then you're going to get into your manufacturing, which now in a global economy is probably not in your country. Let's say it's in China or Bangladesh or India. That's where the factories are. And that's where the sewing is done. That's where the cutting is done. They might print the fabric for you there. That is where, if you're doing smocking, embroidery, any kind, it's all done in that manufacturing part, okay? And LA still has quite a bit of manufacturing, but not a lot. But let's say the part of the supply chain that it's impossible to have in America is the level of making the fabric, okay? So prior to, like I said, when we first started making ready-to-wear, cotton was grown in the South. I mean, you know, that's what slavery was all about, growing cotton. So we had we grew the world's cotton in the South. After the Civil War, we continued to grow cotton. It wasn't quite, its profitability was starting to dwindle because the growth of cotton really does, unfortunately, it's at its most profitable with slave labor, because cotton is a very hard plant to manage. It takes a lot of cultivation and it's very hard to pick. So for you to have the labor force to grow and produce cotton, you need a big labor force, and you have to be able to pay them cheap. So cotton and slavery go hand in hand, which is why cotton is no longer, sorry, my dog wants up, which is why cotton is no longer grown in the South, because we can't, even at a $7.25 minimum wage in the South, it would not be profitable to grow cotton there anymore. The land is actually worth more than the cotton would be. So now cotton is grown in other parts of the world that haven't industrialized because they can pay either it's slave wages or they're not getting paid wages at all. And so that level of the supply chain in making garments, the fabric level, growing the goods to make the fabric and weaving the fabric, doesn't exist in America anymore. So that part of the supply chain you can't even buy. Most fabric is coming from Asia, and most of it is all grown in Asia because a lot of Asia hasn't industrialized yet. So labor can be cheap, as well as Africa. Sewing, you can still, that part of the supply chain, you can still sew in America. You're going to pay for it. And the big sewing places are the West, as in the Southwest, Florida, parts of New York, really where there's going to be a big immigrant population. That's where sewing is going to be the most reasonable. So like LA still has it. LA gets busted for, humanitarian issues all the time. For example, there was a brand, American Apparel, that got busted for chaining the women to machines in LA, and these women were basically kidnapped. Like, it's not sex trafficking because it wasn't sex, but it was like stealing women from other countries to work in these factories, and they were found chained to these machines. It was awful. So it does happen in America, but it gets busted here. Whereas in countries like Bangladesh, it's not illegal. So a company like, say, Forever 21 can move all their sewing to Bangladesh, pay dirt cheap prices, and then be able to offer cheap prices to the American public. And the American public isn't the wiser because Forever 21's offices are, say, in LA, and they're nice, and it's a nice presentation. And so we kind of look the other way on the part of the supply chain that's the actual manufacturing of the goods. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions?
I don't have
Are you kind of following the supply chain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically in today's world, your offices are generally in the country you're from or where you work, and then you're manufacturing in the way that capitalist fashion works is that it would be in a country that can offer you much cheaper rates than your home country. And then if you manufacture in your own home country like we do, we have to import all of our fabric from Asia because the growth and the manufacturing of fabric has completely left America. We have to import all of our own, all of the like notions like zippers and thread and that kind of stuff, because that no longer is made in America. I'm trying, oh, and the other thing that is no longer made in America, does not exist on an American supply chain, is knits, like sweaters. So knits left America sometime in the 80s. Those American companies that built the Chinese factories, they really invested in machinery in those Chinese factories, and knits was one of the main things they really invested in. And there was a big knit boom in the 80s. Like if you guys ever watch or see like reruns of like the Cosby Show or those 80s sitcoms, you'll see them all in these crazy sweaters. So knits had a huge resurgence in the 80s, and a lot of that has to do with those factories. The big brands like DKNY or Ralph Lauren, when they built these factories in China, they invested in machinery, and knits machinery was one of the things they really went heavy in, because it was going to be so much cheaper to make those knits in China. They could buy the yarn for a lot cheaper, because remember, America is no longer producing those raw goods. And so the repercussion now, 30 years, 40 years down the road, is that there's none of this is now manufactured in America. And not only is it not manufactured in America, we don't even have the technology to compete with these Asian countries. We couldn't even begin to compete with them on production or price point. And so I guess, you know, that's kind of where we're at now. So, and sewing is leaving America. Very few places can you get sewing anymore. So really the fashion supply chain, so little of it is actually in America. And one thing about DKNY, Donna Karen, is at some point in the early 2000s, Donna Karen announced that her design offices were moving to Shanghai. So Donna Karen of New York, her corporate and design offices were no longer going to be in New York. They were then now headquartered in Shanghai, and that would help bring their costs down. And then that way their designers could watch the factories in Asia much easier with a lot less expense. But I think what also that says is that as the supply chain got bigger and more global, designers didn't feel like they had to be tied to their home country as an identity to that fashion brand. And so that's a real break from the past and from what kind of defined the American and European fashion point of view. If, you know, for example, Levi's jeans is solely American and even more so Californian. And the denim has always been produced in South Carolina. And one type of denim for one type of jean is still made in South Carolina, but the rest of it is actually all made in Asia. And so I think, you know, that's just the repercussions of one, being global, and two, ready to wear, consistently trying to bring the price point down so that so the audience gets wider and wider and wider, to where we now have like a mass market fashion industry that didn't exist before. Basically, with making the supply chain global, brands like Forever 21 and H&M and Zara could exist. Before that, those kinds of things just didn't exist, because there would be no way to make that much goods at that cheap of a price. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Do you guys have any questions?
No.
No? Okay, well, let me explain to you what your assignment is for the week, and we'll see if then you have a question. If you haven't already watched a documentary on Netflix called The True Cost, I am assigning that for this week, and it really talks about, it really focuses on a couple major brands that you guys will know. For example, I believe The Gap, Nike, H&M, I think Topshop, but I can't remember if it was Topshop, Zara. They got busted. One of them, their factory burnt down in Bangladesh with the people in it. Is horrible. The movie is really about the idea of the global supply chain and ethics, and sort of where does it lie? At what point is the designer actually responsible for how these garments are made? And is there a cost? Do we need to be saying that people, we can't pay so cheap for fashion that people are less valuable? So what is the cost? What is the value here? And the documentary is really about that. And it really dives into a lot of these brands that you guys will know that are on these very small production windows. For example, like I think it's H&M that delivers new collections every 6 weeks. Well, that's they are making an incredible amount of product, and they're cheap. So they're making it quickly and cheaply. And so you kind of have to ask yourself what's going on in that supply chain for them to be able to accomplish that. Because a line like, say, mine, we make 2 collections a year. So you can, every 6 weeks is an obscene amount of product. And so the documentary kind of dives into that. And then, so the assignment itself will be to watch the documentary and then to write, kind of pretend like you're a fashion journalist and write an expose on the global supply chain, and really ask the question of where does ethics belong for the designer? Should designers be responsible for their supply chain or not? You know, like, do we have a duty to be worried about how our products are made, and one, how it's influencing people, how it's influencing the environment? Is chasing a cheaper price always the right way to go? Maybe in some ways it is, maybe in some ways it isn't. Some people could argue that having a global supply chain is valuable in that no matter your income, you can afford new clothes. You don't have to have someone secondhand. Someone else might argue, no, it would be better to have secondhand clothing and have them be much nicer, and have less products out there, and be responsible for how those products were made and how far they traveled on that supply chain. Those are kind of the questions you want to think about. And another thing to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about this global supply chain is that brands like Zara, Old Navy, H&M, if you donate those clothes to Salvation Army or Goodwill, they're thrown away. They don't go anywhere because they can't be handed on to someone else. The quality is so bad and the construction is so cheap that they aren't good for a second round. So Salvation Army has come out and said it. Old Navy, H&M, Zara, all of those brands, they're just incinerated when they show up at Salvation Army. They aren't passed downable. So these are questions we ask ourselves. And where does the ethics belong in the fashion industry, and where does it belong in the supply chain? For example, Nike got busted. You'll learn about it in the movie. I think in the mid-80s and 90s, they really got busted for horrible factories. And now Nike is kind of one of the leaders in how to be transparent with your supply chain. So you can go on the Nike website and they will trace every step of the way from the conception of the tennis shoe to it being sent to their warehouse, and where it traveled and how the people were the different factories and how they're treated along the way. So Nike has had to be very transparent in their supply chain in order to combat the mess they got themselves in the 80s. And so transparency is important. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is the more you can make local, the more you don't need, the ethics doesn't play its part, because if you're making local, if you're making in America, you're paying the highest, you're paying your state's minimum wage, which is going to be much higher than anywhere else in the world, especially if you're in California. It's the highest minimum wage in the country. You have to adhere to the employment laws, the employment atmosphere. So no matter what, if you're making your garments in, say, San Diego, you are making them at the highest level of human rights possible. And so you really don't need an ethics lesson. But if you're going to take your line and make it say, and follow the global supply chain and buy your fabric from over here, and your sewing's in Bangladesh and your smocking is in India, you better follow that chain very closely and make sure you're in those factories and you know how those people are treated, and that they're being paid, and that they get to go to the bathroom, and that they get to go home at night, and all of these things, and that they're not children. And so I do think there is a level of responsibility that designers or brands have, and I think consumers can start demanding it by kind of knowing if something's too cheap, like something at Costco, you need to ask yourself, how are they doing that with the supply chain? Because you know that it went through so many places. So just remember, when you're looking at a $20 pair of jeans, they had to grow the indigo. They had to turn the indigo into fabric. They had to then take that fabric and make them into jeans. Someone had to make the pattern for the jeans. Someone had to design the pattern for the jeans. And then they have to package those jeans. And then those jeans have to be sent out to stores. That's a lot of steps for it to retail for 20 bucks. So you have to think about, how did people get paid per jean along that way? And that's kind of how you know if there's too many steps if there's too many steps in a supply chain and it's been to too many places and the price is cheap, you have a problem. It's kind of that simple. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Do you guys kind of understand the supply chain, or like, do I need to kind of tell you a little bit more step by step, or do you get it?
I get it.
Okay. Yeah?
Yeah.
All right. Do you guys have any questions about the assignment?
No.
Mm-mm.
No? Okay. Well, you can email me if you do. You know how to find me.
Yeah.
All right. You guys will have a great week. And remember, your assignments are always due like late Tuesday nights.
Okay.
All right, guys. Have a great week.
You too.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.